The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
Our scriptures were written by people who, by virtue of their placement in history, had less access to scientific information and facts and basic common sense than any person in this room. In fact, there's not a person in this room who's ever met a person whose worldview was as narrow as the worldview of Abraham, or Moses, or Jesus, or Muhammad. And most of these people, with a few exceptions, had a moral worldview that was more or less indistinguishable from that of an Afghan warlord today.
Good morning, Joshua. Have you
What's
been?
up? Good.
Been good? That's awesome. I'm great, man. It's been raining here, which has been
Thank
nice.
God.
So it's a nice change of pace when rain hits. It always rains on the day that I'm supposed to mow, which like part of me goes, oh man, and then like part of me actually says, oh man, the next time I actually get around to being able to mow, because it ends up being more of a job.
Bro, I haven't mowed my yard in a month. That's
Yeah,
no
but
exaggeration.
I was gonna say you don't have goats. I was like, yeah, I was gonna say, but you have goats, so that's like built-in lawn care.
Man, not anymore. They're gone.
Yeah, see, so can't even use that excuse anymore. That's unfortunate. Well, Joshua, welcome back, man. This is episode, I think, 38, right? Like we kicked it off last time we did this with a big two-parter, which was super, super exciting. But welcome back, man. This is the Content Warning Podcast, a Bible Meets Culture podcast where we break down the difference between biblical content versus modern theology. And we do have a really awesome video to get to today. But Joshua, I often joke on this podcast. I say joke. I don't often joke. I just make the very factual statement that I very rarely am anywhere close to the smartest guy in the room. And I love that. I love not being the smartest guy in the room. And so is the case today, where I'm absolutely nowhere close to that. So, but I'll let you introduce our guest because you have a bit of a closer relationship with him than I do. But go ahead and introduce who we got on today.
Well, I would very much suggest that Isaac might be the smartest guy in the room today. I've admired Isaac and his work for a long time. Of course, we go all the way back to Freed-Hardeman together. Isaac, I don't remember what year you were when I came in as a freshman, but you were there basically the whole time I was there working on some degree of some kind. Isaac holds 2 degrees, 2 graduate degrees from Freed-Hardeman as well as an undergraduate degree. Master's in New Testament, Master's of Divinity. Is that right, Isaac?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Isaac and his wife, Brittany, live in Chapel Hill, Tennessee, and are working with the Chapel Hill Church of Christ and been doing that for a number of years now and doing a great job there with a wonderful congregation just right down the road from where I live. So very proud of Isaac. He's teaching at the Nashville School of Preaching now as well. Right. And I know doing great work there, training future preachers. So Isaac, it is very, very wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. And thank you, Nathan. I remember it seems with each passing year, it gets more embarrassing how long ago that was.
Yeah, tell me about it. I'm starting to have aches and pains I didn't know I could have.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't know if we're in the old category yet, but it's slowly creeping up on us.
We're getting there.
Yeah. Well, appreciate both of you guys and the work and ministry that you do. And thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to today's time.
Oh, we're super excited to have you. Appreciate you giving us your time. I do want to embarrass Joshua for just half a second because I remember when I was a freshman. So again, not to date anybody, but when I was a freshman coming into Freed, I remember seeing Isaac several times just kind of passing because we all lived in the same dorm. And I'll never forget, Joshua said, that right there is the swollest preacher I've ever met.
Still true. Still true.
Yeah. Well,
I forgot to mention Isaac and Brittany own a gym. So,
yeah.
I mean, what can you do?
That's right.
I do. There was a time, not that Joshua doesn't care about fitness anymore, but I would say that there was a time in Joshua's life where that was a larger focus than it currently is. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but I always thought that was funny. That's how we compassionately refer to you for at least a year or so. But anyway,
hey, man, I take that as a great compliment. My
absolutely.
wife and I, we own a gym in Chapel Hill, and yesterday I had a Bible study with two young men who are members at the gym, and baptized them last night.
That's
2
awesome.
brothers.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And one of our members was here, just happened to be here when I was baptizing those 2 young men. And he said, "Well, how did you meet them?" And I said, "Well, through the gym, And I said, when we were in school, we had a saying: "Getting swole and saving souls." And
That's
so,
right.
so
Soldiers of Christ.
Yeah,
still
there
trying
you
to
go.
uphold that motto, right?
Very perfect. That you make T-shirts and coffee mugs and the whole 9 yards, right? That'd be. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. But guys, we're going to talk about Sam Harris. I almost said Sam Pittman. I got football on the mind right now, and that's not the right Sam that we're referring to today. But Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a fairly well-known, very outspoken member of the atheist community. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He wrote a book, and this is Joshua and I kind of talked about this before we started recording. Sam, even though he's existed in what we have kind of referred to on here as both eras of atheism, Sam has kind of existed almost as a bridge into the old school atheistic, not necessarily worldview, but approach to things. And he's led himself and a few others that we've talked about kind of into this new age where there's less abrasiveness. It's still a little bit cold from time to time. Like Sam is a really easy guy to listen to, but if you watch enough of your videos, or of his videos rather, he seems kind of cold at times. Like he's just a very methodical, very analytical guy. And there's something that attracts people to that, right? He's not just going to come flat out and call you an idiot to your face if you believe in God. He's going to make you think that you're an idiot without actually telling you that. And so it's kind of that new wave that we've referred to it as that new wave approach to atheism. But he's a New York Times bestseller. Wrote a book back in 2004 called, I think it was called The End of Faith. But the subtitle was fear. What was it? Anyway, I'm not going to try to remember that. But it was the future of reason. It was religion, terror, and the future of reason. Was I think the subtitle of that particular book. But it ended up in a realm where he's a fairly popular guy within the atheistic community. And he makes a couple of really bold statements here, Joshua, that we're going to get into. But the premise of this video, like the overall premise of this video, and I'll let you guys give me your first thoughts here in a second, was that solely due to their placement in history, the biblical authors essentially can't be trusted, right? Based on their placement in history and their lack of knowledge, as well as he really points to two things: their lack of knowledge and their moral worldview. He claims are basically two reasons that you really shouldn't trust people that lived in the time frame in which they lived in, who are making the claims that they're making. And so maybe if that's a fair assessment to you guys, I'll let you kind of flesh it out. But give me your first thoughts.
Yeah, I thought that the statements that Sam Harris were making were very much unfair to the biblical authors. Forget that I'm a Christian and believe in the inerrancy and infallibility and inspiration of Scripture for just a second. To use that argument, if we bring that argument into other aspects of life, let's say, what makes my worldview as a 21st century American better or worse than the worldview of a 21st century Chinese individual? They live in a different space. They have different cultural mores. They have a different perspective. And our worldviews are different based on life experiences and things of that nature, even though we share time, right? We're existing at the same time. So proximity in time is not a great argument. Now, there are things about the text of Scripture, because it is ancient, that we have to go back and think about, and we have to put ourselves in their shoes and adopt their worldview. But I have to do the same when I read, something that someone in the Far East has written.
Sure.
Right. I have to put myself in their shoes. So that's my first thoughts. I'll let Isaac take it from it.
No, I totally agree. And I've listened to Sam Harris and some of his lectures, and I've heard him on various podcasts over the last several years. But I do think it was kind of a very weak argument going along with what Josh said, and that worldview, as he defines it, is constantly changing. And so Sam Harris's, largest claim to fame is a book he wrote in 2004, give or take. And if you think about just the worldview of what was going on in the world in 2004, 3 years after 9/11, heavy involvement in the Middle East, the coalition of not just the American at that point, but, European. I mean, if you just think about, Sam Harris himself and his own worldview, by his own definition, from 2004 to 2024, is vastly different than it is today. And so I feel like along with Josh said, the time, if you take what he's trying to say about the worldview is constantly changing. So, I think he would even say that, can you read a book from 20 years ago and get anything out of it? Well, he would say, well, of course you can. Well, okay, well, all right. So let's talk about the worldview. And I felt like in the video, he was trying to say that there's no difference between the worldview of a modern day Taliban leader, is what I think he said, versus those in the biblical world, which is, and it's meant to be kind of a shock and awe kind of gotcha, but it makes no sense
Sure.
by his own definition. And so I thought it was kind of a weak straw man argument.
No, I agree. I think it's interesting because I think we see this, Joshua, in a lot of the videos that we do is with a guy like Sam Harris, who, like you said, the probably his most notable work was something done in 2004. He's not actually published a book, to my knowledge, since 2015. So, I mean, you're still looking at nearly 10 years removed from his last, literary work. That one, I think, was predominantly focused on Islam. But I think what you see with a guy like Sam Harris, and in general with a lot of the atheistic community is the Christians are burdened by, and maybe I say burdened or blessed, depending on how you look at it, at shooting at a fixed target. The atheistic worldview requires you to have a constantly moving target. And I think that's something that's incredibly interesting. And so a Christian has to defend. Let me put it this way: maybe a Christian has to defend a fixed target, right? That's a burden that we have, but also a blessing that we get to defend a fixed point of view, a fixed target. And I think in maybe Sam Harris's mind, maybe too narrow of a target to shoot at, right? Whereas the atheist has to constantly defend something that is moving. It's harder to hit, but it's also harder to defend in a lot of ways too. And so kind of the point that I think you both are saying is there's an argument that he's making that by his own definition, he's moved the goalposts, so to speak. And so we'll break that down kind of step by step here. But he starts off the video by making this claim that due solely to their placement in history, the biblical authors had less access to scientific information, facts, and common sense. So those are the three things that he points out specifically. And again, Joshua, we do try to sometimes give credit where credit is due. I think that we can agree that when it comes to scientific information, just based on the sheer volume of scientific information that we currently have today, yes, they probably had less access to that, right? Like we know what happens if you split an atom. I'm not sure Moses probably understood that concept. However, to say that just due to the sole volume of scientific information that we have access to, that inherently makes us, for my word, not necessarily his, but that somehow inherently makes us smarter. There's a reason we use a cliche term: the more you know, the less you know, right? Or like the more you learn, the dumber you are. Something along those lines. So, I think there's a right wrong thing there, and then we'll break down the idea of facts and common sense maybe here in a minute. But give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Frank Turek, who I'll just be completely honest, I'm not Frank Turek's biggest fan. I appreciate the great zeal with which he defends apologetically the scriptures and the existence of God. I think the way in which he does that could be better. But Frank Turek wrote a book called Stealing from God. And in that book, he makes a provocative argument where he says, science does not tell you anything. Scientists tell you stuff. And so what he argues there is that scientists interpret data. And it's the interpretation of data that tells you what is quote unquote fact. Now, I think that the argument in the book is somewhat weak. It's a weaker point of his book, but it is interesting though, because if you want to talk about, well, the ancient authors didn't have scientific worldview. Well, they may not have known how to split an atom, like you said, but dadgummit, they knew stuff. They knew you plant a seed in the ground and you water it, you get a crop. They knew that if you come in contact with a dead body, you run the risk of getting disease. Right? I mean, they knew these things. Mm-hmm. So they weren't dumb. And this is something that Another biblical scholar, Michael Heiser, has made a huge. Michael Heiser's dead now, but made a huge point about, is he said you cannot read, particularly the Old Testament, and say that these authors were dumb. They're not dumb.
Yeah.
They know a lot of things. They know various things, and it is unfair to these people to call them dumb, which is so. I'm sorry, I'm on a rant, but it's so frustrating to me to hear someone, I don't care if it's Sam Harris or anybody else, say, talk about the ignorance or the so-called lack of knowledge of these ancient authors, and then turn right around and talk about things like the Code of Hammurabi, which predates the Law of Moses, or talk about Socrates, who predates Jesus, as if they hung the moon, and then talk about these other ancient peoples because they're biblical authors and say, well, they didn't know anything. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Sure. You have to attribute a level playing field if you're going to do it that way. So, yeah, it's interesting. They're not dumb. The ancient authors weren't dumb at all.
Yeah, and I agree. And I feel like the access to information makes you smarter is a weak argument. I would dare say the average IQ in the United States today is lower than it was
certainly
40 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
And think about the access of information before the average person in 2005, if you wanted to know something, you'd had to go to your local library, and now with, post 2002, 3, 4, with the internet and all kinds of databases and stuff, I mean, you've got more information on your phone. I mean, I have more access to information on my phone than the NASA scientists did that landed on the moon. I'm not smarter than the scientists that landed, the modular on the moon,
right.
Even though I have more access to data. And so just we have more access to data, I don't think is a valid argument. And then also, the scientific, I know the Bible is not meant to be a scientific book, but there are scientific truths in the Bible. And so it's like, okay, well then they didn't have that access. Then how do they know these things?
Sure.
Where did that come from? If they're just, living in a cave and have, sub IQ levels. It just doesn't make sense.
No, I completely agree. I think it's one of those things that's kind of interesting because he mentions the scientific information, but then he goes on and mentions they have less access to facts, which, Joshua, you and I have talked about this before, and I'll reiterate it. When a Christian engages in a conversation like this and you hear a claim that, well, the biblical authors had less access to fact, it is not the Christian's responsibility to defend that claim, right? It's the atheist's responsibility to defend the claim that they're making. And so as a Christian, you simply need to ask, okay, well, which facts are you referring to? Like what are some facts of life that they didn't have access to or didn't know? And how do we prove that they didn't have access or didn't know to those things? Because Isaac, as you just mentioned, there are things that were given to, it's almost as though, and you can track this through history, that as history has moved along, you constantly see almost a regression of knowledge before quote unquote discovery takes place, right? And so there's when you go back and you look at like a lot of the Levitical laws and a lot of the practices that the Israelites were supposed to upkeep, and you look at a lot of the rules and how they don't necessarily make sense about types of dishes they were supposed to wash versus destroy, the reason they weren't supposed to be around corpses, and so on and so forth. The example that I always like to kind of point to was I've never really known how to pronounce his last name, but Dr. Semmelweis, if you guys have ever heard that name, I don't know if he's the doctor who gets credit for implementing hand washing in hospitals. This was a guy who lived back in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, somewhere in that range. He was a Hungarian obstetrician who wanted to know why some of the hospitals had really, really high mortality rates amongst newborn infants. And what he discovered was people would move immediately from surgery to delivering babies without washing their hands, and those that did wash their hands in dirty water. And by virtue of that, they discovered, hey, maybe we should, sanitize our hands. But again, this was the 1800s, right? And yet, if you go back and you look at, again, I completely agree with what Isaac said. The Bible's not meant to be used as a scientific textbook. But when you look at, hey, there was a cleansing ceremony that had to take place if you were to touch a dead body, you go back and maybe you put two and two together and think, well, okay, maybe somebody knew something that we knew and then didn't know. Does that make sense? So the idea of having less access to fact, I think rubbed me the wrong way. Not as wrong as it rubbed me when he said that they didn't have common sense. Which, Joshua, I'll let you. You've done so good at ranting today. I'll let you go on that one as well. That one wrote like the scientific info. I can kind of let slide, but the less access to fact, and that they just didn't have the same common sense that we have today. Coming from a guy who was a youth minister during the eating Tide Pod phase of our adolescent society, I find it really hard to argue for more common sense existing today than did maybe earlier on in history. But Joshua, give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the statement that they didn't have as much common sense begs the question: what is common sense? How do you calibrate and measure common sense? As I was telling you before we started recording, like in Genesis, when there's a famine, Abraham tells Sarah, "Let's go to Egypt."
Mm-hmm.
That's common sense. We don't have food. We need to go get food. Common sense dictates that you feed and take care of the people in your charge.
Sure.
There are other examples, sure. Here's another thing. Common sense or scientific fact or whatever you want to say only makes sense for a rational being who has the ability to think and be logical. And Sam Harris will be the first to tell you, just like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens in this new atheism, they would be the first to tell you that we are only the product of our DNA. Right? So we are only the product of atoms and DNA.
Sure.
If that is the case, and you attribute that to the ancient authors, then they're the only product of their atoms and DNA. And so by that rate, they don't have a worldview at all. They're just doing what their atoms and DNA dictate that they do.
So let me throw a definition out to you and see if this helps or not when it comes to this concept of common sense, because common sense is defined as being knowledge, judgment, and taste, which is more or less universal and held with more or less without reflection or argument. So common sense is defined as knowledge or judgment, which is universal and without argument, more or less. So when you apply that to the biblical worldview, is that not something then that could constantly change, right? Like you don't earn more or less common sense. It just depends on, because common sense for us says, don't walk through a busy intersection. Common sense to somebody who lives, like you said, in China may be very, very different than that, right? So there's a constant change that you can't just cap it and say somebody's got more or less, given, especially given their place in history, right? Kind of what you were saying, like common sense for us, like if we were out of food, we wouldn't go to Egypt, right? Like we would drive to the grocery store. So, but there is an element there that exists of at a basic level that they demonstrated time and time again that I think sometimes maybe even we lack today.
Yeah, I will say too, sometimes common sense can get in the way. So let me explain what I mean by that. In the ancient world, they knew, based on scientific fact, if we want to go down that road, that you have to have rain in order to have crops. They did not know that rain was produced by evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Right? They didn't understand the scientific water cycle.
Sure.
So, but they knew that there was let's say they believed, that's a better way of talking about it. They believed that there was a deity who controlled the weather. In Israel, that deity was Yahweh. In Canaan, that deity was Baal.
Mm-hmm.
And when the children of Israel conquer the land of Canaan and are then influenced by Canaanite cultures, they start praying to Baal, right? Why? Because common sense told them we need something to help our crops grow. But common sense got in the way where they weren't doing what God told them to do. So maybe it is the case that common sense can get in the way. And I think that's what Sam Harris might even be saying in this video in a roundabout way, that common sense is getting in the way of your naturalistic, objective, scientific worldview.
Yeah.
So, and I would be careful about that. Common sense is a blessing. Common sense is a product of the soul and the mind. But the ancient people had common sense. They knew, don't stick your hand in a snake pit.
Sure.
No, I agree. And I think what Nathan said is correct. Common sense changes. You give the average person an iPhone today, they'll be able to make a phone call. Give the average person 60 years ago, they couldn't. So what's common now isn't common then. 1960s, everybody knew what a man and woman were. Today, you got a sizable part of our population that everyone doesn't know. So, I guess common sense is in flux.
To piggyback on that example, Isaac, if you give a 17-year-old an iPhone and tell them to call their mom, they can do it.
Oh, yeah.
If you give a 17-year-old a rotary phone and tell them to call their mom, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. So there are knowledge gaps there. That common sense factor is always something that's different. So to say that one, or depending on what generation you live in, had more or less common sense, I think is debatable in some regards, but also you can't not attribute common sense to people that existed in a particular era of time.
Totally. And I think sometimes we have kind of a superiority complex because we know how to use technology, which is great. The average American can use a computer or a phone, but I feel pretty confident in saying if you took the average American and you dropped them in 2000 BC with Abraham, they would die within 2 months.
Yeah.
Because
I'm impressed that you give somebody 2 months.
Yeah. I mean, because their lack of survival skills, which is common sense, it wouldn't have to be 2,000 years ago. You could drop them off, in the days of Jesus 1,000 years ago, they'd probably have a pretty hard time. And so we look at them as being very unimpressive, but I feel like if many of us were transported back to their day, I think they would find us wanting in many areas.
Absolutely. Well, Isaac, I'll go ahead and I'll let you piggyback that onto, because I think it kind of leads us right into this next point that he makes, because he makes the claim that not only do these biblical authors have less access based on surely their moment in history, have less access to some of these things, but he also claims that they have some of the most narrow worldviews of anybody in existence. And he specifically, which I thought this was interesting, I guess as an atheist, you wouldn't necessarily care to make this distinction, but he makes the comment about Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And the only thing going through my mind was one of these things is not like the other. That was the only thing that was playing through my mind. But speak to that if you want to about this idea or concept of the biblical authors had a narrow worldview as opposed to us today, who clearly are so much more enlightened than those of ancient times, we'll call it.
Yeah, and I think this is something that goes back to the Enlightenment. This idea that the Dark Ages, and now that we have been enlightened, and that everybody else before us was in darkness, so to speak. And I just don't think it's true. I think if somebody would sit down and read the Bible with an honest and open heart, as they've been doing for thousands of years, you read Ecclesiastes, you read Proverbs, you read the Psalms, I don't think you come away after reading those things and thinking, these people were idiots who didn't know anything. That was a waste of time. Oftentimes, or at least in my experience, I think, wow, I these people have more insights on family dynamics, business practices, interpersonal skills, communication, than, the self-help books that you would find at Books A Million. And so I think that it's easy, and I don't know Sam's or anybody else's, relationship with the Bible, but I do feel like if most people would open up and read it, I don't think they're coming away from the text thinking, wow, those people had a very narrow worldview and were uneducated in those things. I think it's very complex and stands the test of time and speaks to our own situation. A different culture, different, by Sam Harris's definition, different worldview, and and yet it still has the ability to change hearts and minds, which I think shows how timeless it is. And it's kind of hard for a book to be timeless after thousands of years when it's written by someone who's, uncultured, unlearned, and no sense of worldview or common sense. It just doesn't add up.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that gets me about saying the authors didn't have an expansive worldview is that, a worldview by definition, not to be, crass or anything, but worldview is how you view the world.
Exactly.
And in our 21st century Americanized context, we view the world through cultural mores, being an American,
Mm.
being in a republic as a government with elected leaders, having the freedoms to do certain things. And I don't know if y'all have read this book or not, but I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It's by a young lady who escaped North Korea. Naomi Park or something like that is her name. It is an incredible book because she talks about growing up in North Korea, and her worldview is vastly different from mine because of how she was raised and where she was. Okay, we'll attribute that then to the biblical authors. Abraham himself travels over 700 miles in his journeys and goes all over the world. I mean, he goes all throughout the land of Canaan. He goes down into Egypt. He goes into the land of the Babylonians. Of course, not the Neo-Babylonians that we read about in the exile, but in the land of the Babylonians and Paddan Aram and all that. And he engages with people in these places and does so relatively easily. It's interesting to me here, like fast forward to Moses. You have Moses who grows up in Egypt, leaves Egypt and goes to Midian. Midian is a vassal state of Egypt, but he has no problem getting along with the Midianites. Goes back to Egypt, then takes on the Israelites and brings them into Canaan, or brings them to Canaan. Joshua brings them into Canaan. So you have all of these different cultures, and any student of ancient history will tell you the Canaanites and the Egyptians, while they have their similarities, are fundamentally different, right? And then you have one group of people who's going back and forth over the two. And I mean, you read in the Bible certain things that echo these other nations. Like, for example, the Ark of the Covenant, which I believe is totally given by God, and I believe that the construction of that was given by God, but I also believe God works with what they knew. So you have the Shrine of Anubis in Egypt, which looks almost identical to the Ark of the Covenant. Mm-hmm. Well, God worked with them with what they knew to honor him. But that shows me there's an expansive worldview, that it's cross-cultural in a way that today I'm not so sure that we get anymore.
Sure.
We're not very cross-cultural anymore.
Sure, absolutely. Park's memoir, by the way, was published in 2015. It's called In Order to Live, if that's the book you're referring to. Yeah.
That's it.
That was, she wrote that. It was published in 2015. As of 2023, it sold over 100,000 copies. She also wrote another book called While Time Remains.
Yes, both are fantastic. If you want to have your heartstrings plucked, and if you have anything to do with higher education, read the second book and you will be disgusted. She went to Columbia University at the time when the wokeness was very it still is, but was starting to get incredibly prevalent in Ivy League universities, and it will make you sick to your stomach.
Yeah. So that was her books that she's released in the last 10 years or so. But all of that to me kind of begs this question of one, and again, this is based on the way that my brain works from time to time. I'm thinking about this sometimes from a debate point of view, which is not necessarily what this is, but he makes this claim that these biblical authors had a narrow worldview, but he doesn't offer anything to back that up. And we've talked about this before at length, right? The problem with TikTok is the fact that you get these little hot button snippets and they sound great for the press and they make you think, but there's no real substance to a lot of what they say, only in the sense that, he didn't make any sort of claim as to why they had a narrow worldview outside of maybe his follow-up comment about their moral worldview, which we'll talk about in just a second. But so the lack of claim or the lack of evidence to support said claim, one, is somewhat troubling to me. because as you both have pointed out, I don't know that there's a whole lot of evidence to claim that they had a narrow worldview, as you know, from their sense of what was existing and what did exist in the time that they were alive. But it also brings into question, in my opinion, and you all can disagree with this, it's perfectly fine. But to suggest that, again, the assumption here is that we have a greater worldview than that of the biblical authors simply because of the time that we live in now. And I feel as though that's almost, if not completely, a really arrogant statement to make, right? That because of us existing in 2024, we have a greater worldview than that of the cultural authors. When if you were to ask any average person in America, just because that's where we live, hey, who just won the election in Europe? What political party won the election in Europe? I would dare say that 98 out of 100 people could not tell you what that was. Probably couldn't name a single political party in the United Kingdom, right? And the only other two that could are those that just really have a passion for deep diving in world politics. But that almost feels as though it's a very arrogant statement to say that, well, because of who we are today, we have a greater worldview than the biblical authors, which by its very nature, if it is overly arrogant of us to say that, wouldn't that then apply that we have a narrow worldview because of our arrogance, right? And so there's this constant loop that you get caught yourself in. And maybe this is pointless thinking and rambling on my part, but that was the part of this whole conversation that kind of bugged me, that Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, whoever they were, that they had a more narrow worldview due solely to the concept of when and where they lived. But I think you can make those same applications to us today. The average 16-year-old U.S. kid has a very narrow worldview based on the fact that, and you could make the argument, this is again, not to derail this too much. You can make the argument though, that a 17-year-old kid that was born and raised in Billings, Montana, and has never traveled outside the state of Montana has a more narrow worldview than any of the biblical authors. Right? Because the only thing that they know, the only way they know how to view the world outside of what they see on television is Billings, Montana. Right? And so to me, that just feels like an arrogant statement to make, that solely based on who we are today, we have a less narrow worldview of how the world exists, unless you're referring to the concept. And Josh, we kind of talked about it. Again, I don't want to derail us from the point of the conversation, but unless he's referring to things, again, backing into the scientific aspect of things, the idea of flat earth and the water process that you mentioned, or the rain water cycle that you mentioned, stuff like that just there feels as though there's a gap that we're ignoring, and it feels as though there's the superiority complex that exists and I'll be really honest, I think it's a superiority complex that exists predominantly, at least from our opinion, in the worldview of those who are Americans.
Yeah, well, let me clarify something.
Sure.
There's a difference between worldview and world events.
Sure.
Because we talk about, and we've been talking about it, they correlate, but they're not synonymous. So we have this idea that, well, if we live in America, but we're familiar with what's going on in the world, like who won the election in Europe, then we have a better worldview. Okay, right. Yes,
or do we just have a better grasp of what's happening externally?
That's true, but worldview and world knowledge are not the same. Well, worldview is your perspective on how one is to act in the world. And so what I think Harris might be getting at is, in the biblical worldview, particularly among the biblical authors, you have things like the taking of innocent life, particularly now the argument would be with abortion. Like, okay, well, they believe that because they had this particular worldview, but we believe that you can kill a child in the womb because it's just a clump of cells, right? That might be something Harris would say. Or marriage, right? Marriage between one man and one woman. Well, that was their worldview, but our worldview is two people who love each other, no matter who they are, should be able to get married. And so the worldview has changed, But back to what Isaac said a few minutes ago, and this was a good point, Isaac, that common sense demands an objective reality of truth. And when you throw objective truth out, you have to, by nature, throw out common sense because you have nothing to base that common sense on. So, yeah, worldview is a tricky thing because it is based on culture and based on time, but it's also based on truth. So I'll leave that and let somebody else talk.
Yeah, no, I think both of you are making great points. And I think what Nathan said earlier about the arrogance and, and not to to cast shade on an entire swath of people, but I do think that atheism by and large deals heavily in arrogance. And I think that, Sam, listening to some of his stuff, I think, he kind of deals heavily in arrogance too. And the fact that he is smarter because he is an atheist, and therefore anybody who has a deity centered worldview, which is what the biblical authors had and what we're striving for, I think he just automatically sees that as being foolish, lesser, uneducated. And so I do think there is a heavy sense of arrogance in the fact that I think that someone in his position would say, well, that we have, that we have a lesser worldview because we try to have a Christ-centered worldview, and so he comes from a presupposition of arrogance and that he is enlightened and that others are not.
Sure.
So he's coming from, I think, from a heavy-handed presupposition, right? And that we're the ones who are ignorant, whereas, to be fair to credit, on the other end of the spectrum, I see someone who does not have a Christ-centered worldview as also being ignorant, at least in that they have not for themselves accepted the best option for their life, to have a Christ-centered worldview. And so when you have those two opposing ideas,
well, it's like what Nathan said earlier. He said that Christians have a narrow or a central target to which we hit. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of goes back to what I said a minute ago about objective truth. You've got that. It's a narrow target and you follow that. On the other hand, those who reject Christianity, let's say, might have a bigger target, like with subjective reality, but everything has boundaries on it. So for us, the three of us, because we're Christians, the Christ-centered worldview and wanting to serve Christ and adhering to the Word of God and living a Christ-centered life to the best of our ability, that puts boundaries on what we can and can't do. Sure. But for an atheist who, again, like Sam Harris or Dawkins or Hitchens or whoever, who says you're the sum of your DNA, well, then your DNA is your boundary, right? And who are you to say that my DNA isn't telling me to worship the Lord, right? If that's your belief,
sure,
then you can't. It really it parallels in my mind to some degree the Calvinistic argument of predestination and
sure.
That everything you do is already ordained by God. It's like, well, if this is my DNA, then there's nothing you can do to convince me to change what my DNA drum is beating to. And so that is I don't know. I just think it's a really tricky argument, really bad argument.
Sure.
To use.
And it kind of leads us into this last point that I think Sam is making. And he makes, again, I'll call it the clickbait comment, because I think the most clickbait comment that he makes in the entire thing is how he compares the biblical author's moral worldview, no different than what a modern day, he uses the term modern day Afghan warlord. They have the same moral worldview. And I think this is something that's really important for Christians to remember when you're engaging in, Joshua, we refer to as this borderline postmodern world that we kind of exist in today. And Isaac, something you said made me think of this, and the concept of there's this sense of maybe ignorance that comes from people who haven't chosen the best path for their life, right? The argument that often gets used toward Christians is that, we've got an ignorance for following God in the first place. And one of the big things that gets propped up in a lot of these conversations is atheists, non Christians, however you want to put those people in a particular category. They get propped up because they have a moving target, because they can define their own terms. They try to prop themselves up by giving themselves the moral high ground, right? That there's a more moral sense in which they operate because Christians are bound by what some perceive to be an immoral God or book or whatever the case may be. And so because we live in a reality currently where morals and truth are very much in reality not subjective, but are treated as subjective, you find a lot of times Christians find themselves in a situation where when logic and reason sometimes fail, the moral high ground is given to somebody by themselves, right? And so this comment that he makes about how the biblical author's moral worldview was equivalent of an Afghan warlord today, I'm not trying to make too many assumptions, but there are a couple of comments like that constantly come up, right? There's the commands to kill those from enemy territory is constantly one that is brought up in that sort of moral worldview, and then the concept of slavery, biblical slavery, is something that constantly comes up in a moral worldview, and so maybe we'll see what the conversation goes. So those are the two things that immediately came to my mind. And I guess, Joshua, you and I have done this for, several years now. Kind of, we see some of these same arguments pop up over and over and over and over again about how, well, the Bible doesn't outlaw something that we today deem immoral, right? And again, we don't defend the existence of immoral things in any sort of society tracing back through history. And I think that's the argument he's trying to make, right? Like, just because somebody thought it was okay 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, doesn't mean that it was something that was moral at the time. And we've outlined, Joshua, at times where God kind of directs moral practices on immoral realities. Does that make, if that makes sense? And I may be clouding the waters a bit much there, muddying the waters, whatever the phrase is. I don't know. But Isaac, give me your thoughts on that, Isaac. This concept of biblical authors having a moral worldview that was, let's say, less than ideal.
Yeah, well, first I would say he was wrong. So, and to go in that further, atheists have killed more people in human history than believers have. I mean, just with Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong in China, they've literally killed hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And so to think that atheism is the gateway to enlightenment and communist utopia, which oftentimes go hand in hand, it's just wrong. I mean, it's just historically wrong. And so I don't think that atheism brings us closer to this society where there are no wrongs and that morality is increased, because at its core, atheism is the removal of all morals. If atheism is followed to the letter, there is no sense of morality. It goes back to what Joshua said several times. You're just an impulse of cells. What you do is not right or wrong. You're just responding to impulses in your nuclear, molecular body. Going back to the same worldview as the warlord in Afghanistan and the ancients, once again, I would say that's just not true. And Nathan, I'm trying to think back to one of the questions you had about slavery. And so when you look at slavery in the ancient world,
sure,
and then you look at the laws given in the Levitical Code to the nation of Israel, what you have is a regulation of slavery, right?
Yeah.
And so,
and I bring that up only because that's one of what Joshua and I have discovered, and what you constantly hear in your conversations is, is there's this concept that exists of, because the Bible nowhere within its pages flat out condemns or outlaws the biblical people to abstain from slavery. Therefore, it's an immoral practice condoned or endorsed by God, right? Like, so because God never told the ancient people, hey, do not have slaves, he was endorsing the concept of slavery, which makes him an immoral being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But when you look at the nature of slavery and its
Mhm.
redeeming properties under the old law, and then you see the new covenant where the Apostle Paul is telling slave owners to remember that they themselves have a master that they have to give an account to.
True.
And so, vastly different. And I think that to try to equate, the problem is that everybody has they have one idea of what slavery is, and they
Mhm.
project that one idea onto all societies of all time. And slavery has been around for 99% of human existence
Right.
in different facets and different cultures in different ways.
True.
And so it's multifaceted. They're not
Yeah.
all alike. And I think what you see with the biblical slavery, I mean, like you said, it's a very common argument, right?
Right.
God doesn't say don't have slaves, and therefore, it's as evil and terrible as a transatlantic slave of the
Sure.
18th century. It's
Yeah.
like, well, we need to think about this objectively,
Yeah.
and it's not the same thing,
Mm.
And so, but yeah, the fact that the worldview of a warlord versus of an African warlord versus Jesus and Muhammad, I mean, I would say Muhammad, okay, I'm with you there, maybe, but to say that Jesus, the one who said turn the other cheek to love and pray for your enemies, has the same worldview as the Afghan warlord is just it's comical. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Yeah, to take the conversation of slavery one step further, everybody wants to talk about how there were slaves in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Nobody wants to talk about how there were provisions for the slave to have their ear pierced at the doorpost to stay with that master once
Yeah,
the debt was
Sure.
paid off. Why would you do that if it wasn't a good situation for you to be in?
yeah,
The relationship, the dynamic of the relationship was so different in that case than what it was in much of American history. But and another thing, there's provisions in the law of Moses for the release of slaves on the
Mhm.
sabbatical year, right? So you're not a slave forever
Right.
in most instances. So, but people ignore that because they don't want to
Sure.
read the Bible. They want to read what they've read about the Bible,
Yeah.
which is a problem. But to the point of you know having the same worldview and morality of an Afghan warlord. First of all, what a racist thing to say. To pick out the stereotype of this particular person, the Afghan warlord. What a terribly racist thing to say. But to take the stereotype, um, there's a book, I forget who wrote it, called "God Hates You, Hate Him Back," and it's written by an atheist. And my question is, if God hates you but God doesn't exist, shouldn't it be hate no one back? Like no one hates you, hate no one back. That doesn't make sense. A good response to this for our listeners who might want to dig deeper is a book called "Is God a Moral Monster" by Paul Copan. It takes on some of the issues of having multiple wives, slavery, the conquest in particular, and the moral issues there. And it is a great resource to read about that. The idea.
C.J. Wellerman, by the way, is the guy that
Thank
wrote
you,
the God Hates You. C.J. Wellerman.
thank you.
It actually is kind of funny too because that particular book, if you look at the cover of it, has a explicit content warning label on the front cover of that book.
Perfect. Yeah. So the idea of having the same morality as an Afghan warlord.
Yeah.
Well, there are times in the Bible where you read about God commissioning His people to commit acts of war and to do so in the name of God, and that the leaders do so believing that God is on their side. In some cases, they are correct. In other cases, they're not. I'm thinking particularly of 1 Kings 22 with Jehoshaphat and Ahab, where they believed God was on their side and He wasn't, like
Yeah.
Micaiah told them. But there are acts of violence that are done in the name of God. But we have to read that with a different set of glasses.
Sure.
It's not fair to read that with a pompous sense of morality, like a lot of us think that we have.
Mm.
We have to put
Well-
ourselves back in in their context.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to, I think, something that Isaac said earlier, and a question that I wanted to ask, because here's your, and maybe it's not near as complicated as I think it is, but your philosophical conundrum for that is back to what Isaac said. If in the perfect atheistic line, the best moral worldview is no moral worldview whatsoever, does that make us more moral? Right? Does that make sense? Like if the ideal moral worldview is no morality at all, how does that make us more moral than people who had a moral worldview to begin with? When you look at some of the good things that were accomplished through said moral worldviews, right? So the fact that anything, you can argue, I believe, you can argue that everything horrible done in human history was done in the sense of having a broken moral worldview. But by virtue of that, you also have to give credit to that anything good that has been done in human history was done through the premise of having a good moral worldview. And so for an atheist, again, if in the ideal world there is no moral worldview from an atheistic standpoint, to argue for or against any morals whatsoever seems kind of counterproductive. So there's your philosophical conundrum. Are you really more moral if you don't have morals?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, not to derail you, Joshua. That was the thought that kept going through my head. Again, maybe it's less complicated than I'm making it, and Sam could probably give me a really adequate, very well thought out answer.
Well, I've watched several debates like you both have between atheists and Christian apologists about the existence of God and things like that, and it's typically either the moral argument or the cosmological argument that they argue over. Sure. And I think atheists have a leg up to some degree if they use the cosmological argument, in the sense that I think they're able to convince more people than maybe Christians are. But the moral argument, if every Christian apologist who debates an atheist would go straight to the moral argument, they would win every debate. Because you cannot define morality based on culture alone. You cannot do it. And if you believe that you're just the sum of your DNA, then who's to say that if Isaac is a serial killer, I can't throw you in jail. That's you beating the drum of your DNA, right?
Well, and the sad, I guess, side commentary on the world that we currently live in is we're edging toward that exact scenario.
Oh, we're not edging toward it. We're jumping off the cliff with it.
Well, yeah. Well, when you've got legitimate defenses in the court of law that are setting precedent about how, this can't be deemed morally and ethical because this person identifies as such and such. Mm-hmm. It becomes a big problem. And I think we've, again, maybe Sam Harris would argue against that, but I think that there are more and more people that are realizing, okay, no, there's got to be some sort of objective something somewhere, right? No, the world cannot exist in a functional manner if there is no objective standard by which you have things to measure, right? Does that make sense?
Right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. I don't believe in measuring cups, but I'm going to tell you that your measurement is wrong.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
That's I joke about it all the time. There's Joshua, you might have been the one that, no, you weren't the one that told me that. But anyway, if you've ever seen videos of traffic stops with those who identify themselves as sovereign citizens, for those of you that don't know what that is, you're probably better off not knowing exactly what those are. But sovereign citizens are those that, and they will tell you straight to your face, I do not adhere to the authority of the federal government, right? Like, I do not recognize the authority of the federal government. And at some point you have to go, well, that stinks, because the federal government completely recognizes you, right? Like there's a mishap that exists there. And you have to acknowledge that there are factual, objective standards that exist and stay in place. And Joshua, to your point, I think morals has to be one of those, right? Mm-hmm. Truth has to be one of those. And we exist in a time where it becomes kind of a, not to say this isn't a fear mongering thing, and not to put any churches, anxiety through the roof, but we exist in a time where that's becoming more and more and more debatable amongst people, right? Not necessarily to God by any stretch of the imagination, but that's becoming a debatable topic about what is and what isn't true or moral or ethical or reality. And that's something that I think a lot of Christians are going to have to come to reality and learn how to have a conversation about it.
Yes.
Ready, break. As we say, ready, break. Well, guys, that's essentially the video, right? I mean, that's exactly where it sits. And so maybe that was a better way to cap that off. But again, Joshua, you get any closing comments or thoughts? Something we didn't hit? There's always something we didn't hit that I know you wanted to hit, but you debate in your mind about whether or not you should go back and talk about it.
Well, this podcast is kind of like, when you get in the shower the next morning and you're thinking about arguments you had the day before, and you're like, man, I wish I would have said that.
Yeah,
that happens every time. But
100%.
I think we pretty well covered everything pretty well.
Isaac, anything else you want to add?
No. Thank you guys for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
We sincerely appreciate you being on. Guys, as always, man, if you have a video that you see that piques your interest, if you've got questions, just reach out to myself or Joshua. We've said it before, we're relatively easy to contact. You can find us on Facebook. Joshua, I think, is on TikTok. We're actually on TikTok officially. The Content Warning Podcast is on TikTok. We post sporadically on there, but if you've got something you want us to talk about, let us know. And this is, again, we do this because these are conversations that are happening in real time. And these are things that we hope we're equipping somebody somewhere to have better conversations about these topics in the future. So, but if there's nothing else, we'll wrap it up. And guys, we, again, appreciate everybody for listening. And until next time, we'll see you then.